So welcome to this webinar for Governors for Schools on an Ofsted Update 2018. My name is Linda Waghorn. So with no further ado, we'll go forward into the presentation itself. So first of all, a little bit about myself. I'm importantly a Chair of Governors. I'm working with a school with real live children, and so therefore my practice, I think, is the most important thing about me. On that screen there you'll see that I've worked with governors in various roles for over the last 18 years, and I'm a member of the Better Governor team for Babcock, and also I do something which is called Governor Mark, which is an assessment for people who, governing bodies, who want to get a kite mark, similar process to investors in people. So let's move on to the content of the session itself. So the aims of the session this morning is to clarify some understanding about the recent changes to Ofsted that have come in since the beginning of 2018 and how they will apply in practice, and to look at some learning from the spring term Ofsted inspections that have been carried out in the South East. So hopefully some of what is happening in the rest of the South East will be quite helpful to you if you're expecting an Ofsted inspection in the near future. So moving on to the next slide. New handbooks have been issued, not a huge change in the content of the handbooks, so I wouldn't suggest that you need to download and print them out, quite weighty information in there, but the new regime, the new inspection time frame and scale will be operating from all the inspections that were carried out from March 2018 onwards. The changes include some clarification on inspection of non-exempt schools, and I will give you a little bit more information about those in a later slide, and clarification of inspection for exempt schools. So I'll talk about what is an exempt school and what is a non-exempt school, so you understand how that might apply to you. And from the new inspections that have been carried out since March, a focus on special groups, vulnerable groups, in particular Gypsy Roma travellers, and then we'll finish by talking a little bit about careers guidance for those of you that are in secondary, and a little bit about assessment. So moving on to the next slide, the handbooks were published on the 13th of April this year, which fell just before the Easter break for schools. The DfE seemed to publish quite a lot of information just before a holiday or even in the middle of a holiday. But the big change was that schools that have been classified in their last Ofsted inspection report as good, the timeline for re-inspection, a revisit, is stretched from 3 to 4 years. So the legal framework for inspections is within a 5-year window, and practice up until March had been to go to carry out a one-day inspection in schools that were previously good every 3 years. So many schools in that situation would get to the 3-year marker and think Ofsted are going to be coming to visit us for a one-day inspection very soon. Now that window has stretched to a longer time frame of 4 years, and as well as that change, those schools that were not good, and good, remember, is the minimum expectation for schools. So any school that was not yet good had different designations. You'll see in the next bullet point, they were requires improvement, and then 2 categories: special weaknesses, serious weaknesses and special measures, and they each had different timeframes for a monitoring visit to see how they were doing in addressing the development areas that had been identified. And these previously were 18, 24 and 30 months, and this has now been changed in the new documentation to show a re-inspection of up to 30 months for all of those schools. So some changes to the timelines, and that will make a significant difference to those schools where you thought you were about to enter the Ofsted window. So if you are serving on a governing body where already there is some discussion about Ofsted will be coming to see us in the summer term, or we need to be ready for the autumn term, that may well have changed now with these changes in the time frames and timescales. So if we move on to that next slide, and I said I would say a little bit more about non-exempt and exempt schools. So let's have a look firstly at non-exempt schools. These are schools that were previously judged outstanding. So at the last inspection, they had an outstanding designation, and the report gave them that designation. And they are going to be treated in terms of the inspection framework in the same way as good schools. Now, they're non-exempt, which means that they are not exempt from that 5-year window of regular inspection. Now, why are they not exempt from that when they're an outstanding school? This is because if you look at those types of schools, special schools, which have a unique set of pupils who often have very individualised needs, nursery schools, which are our very youngest group of students, and again, they're only at nursery school for a short period of time before they move on to the next phase of education, and PRUs, or pupil referral units, which are short stay schools for children who are at danger of exclusion. You will understand that the populations in each of those circumstances move on to their next stage or back into formal education after a period of time. So the cohorts are very different from each other, and looking at a trend over time would not be possible. So in the background, Ofsted is collecting information about attainment, and they are looking at comparing those schools over a period of time. It's not possible to do that with these types of schools. So they're going to be treated in the same way as a school that was good at its last inspection. That means they will get a 1-day inspection, and that 1-day inspection can't change the designation of the school. It will still remain an outstanding school. But if during that 1-day inspection, the inspector believes that what they're seeing doesn't represent outstanding, that in fact it doesn't even represent good, then they will convert that 1-day inspection to a full 2-day inspection. That 2-day inspection then will look in detail across the school, across the provision, and it can change the designation, and it will end in a formal Ofsted report. If the school provision looks like, from that initial 1-day view of the inspector, as a school that is good but not outstanding, then there will be a letter, an Ofsted letter rather than an Ofsted report, that goes to the school, and it still remains outstanding because a 1-day inspection cannot change the designation, but it will identify those areas where that school or provision needs to improve in order to be outstanding in the future, and the next inspection will be a Section 5 inspection, a 2-day inspection. Will look in detail overall and will end in a formal report. So this is all part of Sean Harford's intention. He's the education lead at Ofsted for schools, and he blogs regularly, often giving insights from questions that have been asked at conferences, and in his blog, when the new timescales and handbooks were issued, he said that this was all part of the Ofsted's intention to catch schools before they fall. So these unique type of schools with a unique set of pupils, not looking at a trend over time, but being supportive in the way in which they will use the inspection team to make sure those schools have an opportunity to understand what areas they might need to concentrate on to remain a good and outstanding provision. So let's move on to the outstanding schools that are exempt. So schools that are exempt are those that don't fit that non-exempt category, that were outstanding at the last Ofsted inspection and have an Ofsted inspection report that says they are an outstanding school. And there are some schools, certainly some that I know of in Surrey, where they haven't been inspected since maybe 2008 to 2009. Now, in the background, as I say, Ofsted are collecting information, they're doing a background identification trend data that will suggest that pupils are still achieving well in these schools, still meet those expectations for what an outstanding school would look like in terms of achievement. But they are not part of that 5-year regular inspection regime. So they sit outside of that. There are times identified as a no fixed definition in NFD inspection where Ofsted, as you may already be aware, collects and does research. They may be part of a subject inspection, they may be part of a wider look at schools over a particular theme or area. And if an outstanding school is selected in that way, then it will be a one-day visit, and they would immediately consider what would need to happen if what they see is not falling into line with outstanding practice. So if they believe that that school is no longer outstanding or needs to be looked at in a deeper way, then because it's outside that regular 5-year framework, that one-day inspection will immediately convert to a Section 5, a 2-day full inspection, looking in detail at the school, ending in a formal report which can change the designation. Having a short inspection, as I said, does not change the designation of the school. Question from Louise asking, how do schools know that they are exempt? These are schools that were outstanding at their last inspection, that are not special schools, they're not nursery schools, and they're not pupil referral units, and they are exempt because they have that full report that says they are that they are an outstanding school, and they don't fit into that other category. Your head teacher will be very clear that you are exempt from that regular regime. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, thinking about what we might have learnt from the inspections that were carried out in the spring. Well, first of all, the short inspection regime used to mean that if your head teacher hadn't got a phone call by Wednesday lunchtime saying we're going to come and inspect your school tomorrow, then you could be fairly confident that there wasn't going to be an inspection that week. But Wednesday is not now the last day of notification that an inspection may happen. So Thursdays and Fridays, those are still days where the inspection team will carry out inspections, and this is making better use of all of the team of people. There was some consultation last year that talked about whether there was enough notice for inspectors who were going to be released from their school and did this as part of their serving head teacher role, but also were inspectors. So this is supposed to make better use of the team. There's a question from Leo asking about whether these changes are better or worse. I think if I look at the information that Sean Harford has shared through his blogs, it does seem to reflect the fact that they're wanting to inspection in a slightly different way. Certainly the spring feedback from schools is suggesting that it feels a much more supportive process. opening that window for those schools that are already good, bearing in mind there is still going to be this information check in the background about whether schools are doing well in terms of achievement. And some schools that are designated as good, you remember from the last set of changes for these latest ones that we're talking about today, there was already a focus on being more proportionate about which good schools received a one-day inspection. Some good schools are receiving a two-day inspection right from the get-go. So right from that notification point. So I think what we're finding is that schools that are indicating in some way or another that they might benefit from a deeper look at the information are selected. So it's too early to say whether the changes are for the better or worse. There will be some schools who have been working very hard to get an outstanding designation, and they will be disappointed because they're going to have to wait for another year before inspectors will come and have a look at them. And even then, they may not be, because it's not a full inspection, they're looking for one day, there won't be that opportunity for them to change the designation from good to outstanding. So there'll be some disappointment there. Hopefully, in the other way, the good schools that are having another year before they're being looked at and they're still consolidating their good practice, still working on improvements, there shouldn't be a problem there overall. So hopefully that helps, Leo. So following on from Wednesday not being the last day of the week, there are reports that there is more conversation about child safeguarding with governors and trustees. So this isn't really a surprise given where we are in terms of child safeguarding on a number of fronts, the use of technology, keeping children safe in school is not as much of a problem, because I think most schools have got very good at keeping children safe in their own environment. It is about safeguarding when there are additional concerns for that child, usually from external forces. Now, this is a delicate balance between, as governors and trustees, receiving enough information back from your school to demonstrate that you are reassured as a governing body that all is being done to support children, but also remaining strategic in ensuring that you don't have individual information about any children or families. So here there is a focus by inspectors on how you know what the school's practice procedures are and how you know that the school is working effectively with children, families and external agencies. So being clear that you get good quality information, you ask robust questions, you have possibly a safeguarding governor or trustee who looks in a little bit more detail, makes a visit to school, that there are questions that are asked by the governing body that demonstrate that you are holding the school to account in this area. There has been an increase in the number of inspections that have been triggered following reports to Ofsted, so complaints to Ofsted, which sometimes the schools are unaware of, gone direct to Ofsted rather than through the normal procedures that we would expect in schools. The odd one of those will not necessarily trigger an inspection, but there are both a number of issues where there is a need to look at safeguarding in a school, and that is proportionate and correct that Ofsted take that seriously and have a look at that. But there's been some anecdotal feedback that some parents are complaining to Ofsted and using safeguarding as the trigger for trying to get some action done, when actually the complaint itself was of a nature that could have been managed using the school's complaints procedure. So what are the lessons here? It's around parental engagement. It's around how well the school manages and thinks about concerns that are raised by parents. So is that open? Is it transparent? Are parents listened to? Is your school a culture where there isn't a feeling that a parent can't approach a member of staff or the head teacher and be listened to and taken seriously? So this is a wider issue, but there have been both some very real cases that needed looking at because they were of a safeguarding nature, and some others where parents, feeling possibly a little aggrieved that they hadn't had the answers they wanted in school, have raised a safeguarding complaint directly with Ofsted. Another interesting issue that has come from the spring learning is that around conversations with governors and trustees. So these are more like a professional dialogue than they've ever been before. So rather than a set of questions and answers, exploring areas that the governing body should be confident and familiar with, asking questions around the things that your students, your pupils, their experience with the school. So if, for example, the inspector has started a conversation with you, I'll give you an experience from my own school around suitable reading material, and this was not a focus of our school plan, although the inspector was sitting in our new school library. Following up with the governing body, well, why isn't this an area on your school development plan? This seems to be some of the feedback that is coming from some of these conversations. If through the year as a governing body you have identified things and talked about them in your governing body meeting or in front of the inspector, you are talking about things that need to improve in your school and demonstrating as governors and trustees that you understand these are development areas, the inspector is saying, why are these not shown on your school development plan? And I think this is an area where our practice as governors and trustees could be improved. This is the perfect time of year for your next meeting to include a good conversation by governors and trustees about what sort of things from your experience as governors and trustees at your meetings over the last 8 or 9 months should form part of the school development plan for next year. And I think as governors, if we know our schools well, we will be able to engage in those conversations and we'll be able to have a professional dialogue that, one, helps us to be better in terms of school business planning and then be clear about the sorts of things we'll expect to see when we approve the plan in the autumn term. But also, if we are in that window for Ofsted, it will prepare us, give us some evidence, some points of discussion where actually we talked about the things that we understand are development aspects and we would engage in development planning in this particular way. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Just a little bit about assessment. This has come up a little bit in connection with the appropriateness of the curriculum, and indeed in my governing body meeting last night we did talk about assessment and curriculum as two hands in partnership with each other. So what the inspectors are looking for is the way the assessment information collected in your school, that's usually collected and entered onto an electronic system of some kind. Remember, not all schools have to use the same systems, but it's not only about how the information is collected, but more importantly, how the school uses that information. So primarily, collecting assessment information should help teachers to teach and to know that they need to differentiate for pupils who are doing less well or better than expected. And this may change over the course of a year or from topic to topic, recognising those children who are not solid in their learning in that particular area, or those children who have really understood that and could go that little bit further and expand and deepen their knowledge. So it's about, first and foremost, how the school uses that to ensure that teachers teach well and children learn well. And then there is that second focus of the management team of the school, how they collect that data to show progress over the whole organisation. And governors should have oversight of both of those things. So thinking about what it's not about having huge numbers of graphs and spreadsheets and evidence that says here is the evidence of how these children did this week, this term, this section of the year. And it's not a requirement for this to be done at a particular frequency, particularly in schemes of marking. There's a lot of anxiety about marking. So it's not about how often and what type and what it looks like. It's more about what has been the impact of that marking. If teachers are using the assessment systems in a particular way that helps them focus on better learning and better teaching, the marking is a decision of the school itself. Okay, so how you use the information as governors to ensure that the school is supporting better achievement for all pupils seems to be the key message there. So the question is, as governors and trustees of your particular organisation, are you fully engaged in school development planning? Now, what do I mean by that? Yes, you've got a mechanism that governors and trustees engage with that on an annual basis, and that's evidenced in the minutes. So, for example, you might be invited to the beginning inset days in September, and you might engage as governors in that feedback about how well pupils did in the examinations, either the SATs or the public examinations. And then there is some evidence in the minutes that you've talked about these different things and you've approved the school development plan after a robust conversation. So that would be the best scenario. The second way you could answer that question is to say that there is some evidence. I can think of some occasions when we do have these discussions. However, it could be more robust. If I look at my business practice and how we do that in the world where I am an employee, it is a much more robust process, and we could apply some of that back into our governance work. Or in cases where practice has continued for very many years of the same kind, we've got into the habit of being governors in a way that was appropriate for the past but is now no longer appropriate going forward. The head teacher simply presents the school business plan and we approve it without much discussion, because after all, they are the professional. So any questions about, and can you recognise where you are in either of those three scenarios? And you may, I'm not suggesting you fit exactly into one of those threes, but the one that fits you best. Any questions about possibly something you've tried to do to improve, or something else that you think has worked really well and I can share with other people? Okay, if I haven't got any questions showing up. Oh, Michael, thank you. Very, and can evidence in minutes, so that's excellent. That shows very good practice, and it's really encouraging that we're seeing many more governing bodies who have that kind of practice in place and embedded in what they're doing. Henry, who's just become a governor, doesn't know that yet. Very new in role. I would suggest that those are conversations for the next governing body meeting, getting ready, understanding how business planning will take place to agree that plan in the autumn term. A question from Louise about how Ofsted inspectors are looking for self-evaluation of the governing body. That's a really interesting one, Louise, because this is a question that came up in the last Ofsted set of handbooks, and feedback from that showed that governing bodies really need to think about how well they are governing, what their practice is, both in terms of the type of people that serve on their boards, but also the impact of their governance on the life of the school. So that's really important. But the other aspect that we don't do terribly well as governors and trustees is include some kind of planning around governing body training. So it might be whole governing body training, but also individual training. How are people best prepared to be governors, better governors next year? So whilst we're looking at this particular area of school improvement planning, if you haven't really got a way of your practice developing to include governance and planning, then maybe that's something that you could look at. Planning to be better as a governing body can also be part of, and should be part of, the school improvement plan overall. Just a couple more questions that I'm just reading through. Awareness of skills and having an action plan to improve the practice of governors. Yes, absolutely. If we can put that in place, I think we've got a later webinar scheduled in the summer for looking at self-evaluation of the governing body, so I will talk about that. Nikki is saying, as a new governor, they did speak about that in the first meeting, so that's good. And Michael is saying that you go through the school development plan at the first governing body meeting and ask questions in those areas where they need more clarification. So some very good responses there. Thank you very much for that feedback. So the next slide is around Gypsy Roma traveller pupils in particular. This has been an area, or is an area, where achievement and progress for these pupils is poor across the country, and there are some local authority areas that have larger proportions of Gypsy Roma traveller pupils than others. And of the group of 8 that have significant proportions of those, some are better than others in managing their pupil achievement and progress. So it's trying to find areas of good practice and identifying those and being mindful of that provision. So more than 5% is significant in your school population, but hopefully this is an area where, when you're looking at vulnerable groups and the progress and the achievement of vulnerable groups, if you've got any children in this particular area, but also, and let's not forget, this may not be an issue for your school in your area, what are the vulnerable groups in your school, and being mindful of what the provision is for those people and their outcomes. So if you've got any GRT pupils in your school, have a look, make sure that you're aware of that and can answer any questions if and should Ofsted come to talk to you, but also focus in greater depth where those children represent a significant number of pupils in your school. And even in Surrey, where I'm a governor, there are pockets where this is more significant in terms of a segment of the population than other areas. Particularly here, we're seeing an increase in the number of children who are excluded, permanently excluded, or in the worst cases, persuaded that maybe home education would be better for them. And that absolutely is very unlikely to be better for them. So looking at how that practice is happening in your schools. Thinking about careers guidance, then on the next slide, it's not going to be applicable if you are a primary school, although I would say careers education does start at that very earliest stage. We don't necessarily call it that, and we're not marked in the same way, if you like, from an Ofsted point of view, as we're going to be talking about with secondary schools, but exposure to the world of work, what people do for a living, challenging gender stereotypes about what type of jobs have what type of people working in them. I worked in a school last week where they'd done it was an infants nursery school where they'd done a very particular piece of work, exposing their pupils to non-gender stereotype versions of different occupations, and really widened and broadened that. And that was because some pupils were making comments previously that showed that was possibly something that needed to be addressed. So thinking particularly about secondary schools, new career guidance issued in January 2018. The Gypsy Foundation Careers Guidance Benchmarks are the ones that are going to be used in secondary schools. And this is, again, the focus is on the impact and the quality of the guidance that is provided to pupils, and how well it's preparing those pupils for their next stage of education or working, entry into apprenticeship schemes, entry into higher education, understanding what you need to do in order to prepare yourself for a career that you choose. So again, thinking about what you might want to do in your schools if you are a secondary school. Let's have a look at the next slide, which is a poll. And again, this is one where I'll pose the question and then you can give me some feedback in terms of questions. Is there clarity in your school or your academy about how there is the response to the careers guidance? The RBA are changes to primary school, where we're going to collect some information in primary schools from 2020 relating to baseline assessments. So if we just ignore that for a moment and focus on careers guidance, if you're a school or academy at secondary level, have you had some conversations as governors about this, or is it something that you don't know how your school's responding to this because it isn't a question that has been asked? And if you're a primary school governor, how do you know how your pupils are exposed to the world of work? So if you're a primary governor, and Tara, you've asked the question, is this relevant? The careers guidance isn't relevant, but I think the conversation around how your pupils are exposed to the world of work is part of the curriculum, part of their learning, wouldn't be an unreasonable question here. So any questions from our secondary governors? If you're a governor that is unaware of this, then possibly it's something to ask at your next governing body meeting. If it's a conversation that has been had, and possibly in the light of which other providers you're working with in terms of careers guidance, then again, that is an area where all secondary schools will need to be working towards these benchmarks in the future. Okay, so that's the end of the formal set of slides that I was going to share with you. Any other questions around Ofsted and how that works? I would say that if you are a governor in an academy or a school where you're exempt or you're not expecting Ofsted for the next little while, you might be thinking, well, so what? What does this mean for me? My advice would be that in the absence of Ofsted coming and making a visit to your school, then you are responsible for ensuring that your school is meeting those expectations. So you are responsible as a governing body for saying, we understand what the Ofsted expectations are, and we ensure that our school or academy is operating at that level. That's our work. The inspection team, you could argue, come in to check that as a governing body, trustees and school or academy, you have done self-evaluation across your organisation effectively, and they inspect that you've done that you've got those judgments right. So a couple of questions. Michael has shared a piece of practice that they have a career day at primary, and they invite people from all different types of industries to come and talk to the children. And Diran, I'm not sure if I've pronounced your name right, has asked about, is the Ofsted review process the same for secondary schools and an academy? Absolutely, it is exactly the same process. All types of schools are treated in the same way by the inspection team. Another question from Samantha: are all governors expected to attend Ofsted inspections, and how do we decide who attends? That's an excellent question. It used to be, years gone by, that only the chair and vice chair attended, but now the inspection team will say anybody who can come or talk to a group of governors. You're only being given 24 hours notice at most, and the inspector will say, I can see you at 11 o'clock. So it really is about how many people can make themselves available that quickly. But if you know that you've got an inspection coming up, it is useful to have that conversation about how do we get a cross-section of people, what kind of information are we expected to understand about our school that might be asked about, and that will be about what are you good at, what are your development areas. So who attends is very much who can be available. All governors or trustees can attend. The feedback at the end of the inspection. So it may be that some come during the day when they're available, but others, it's usually a 3 o'clock feedback, so that might not be terribly helpful to a lot of you. But there is no hard and fast rules there. Ofsted do prioritise short inspections based on risk, and they will look at, it's not changes in leadership, it will be about collecting information, yes, about safeguarding complaints, and yes, about achievement, and in those cases a school may be brought forward or have a full inspection. If it's in a 4-year window, it might have a 2-day inspection instead of a 1 day. Tara's asked a question about Governor Mark, which I'll cover in a moment. Jeremy's asked, does the new inspection regime penalise good schools moving to outstanding? Because the timescale has been extended, then yes, but this is building on the back also of short inspections, which will not change the designation, but just in Ofsted speak, say consolidate good practice for the next full inspection. So yes, you will be recognised as a good school, but because you've had a 1-day inspection, they'll schedule you for a 2-day at the next point, but you won't be able to have that designation changed at that inspection point. So yes, it's a longer time scale, and there is a frustration with a number of heads who have been working very hard to change that. I appreciate that some people's time may be over now and they may need to sign off, but Tara has asked a question about Governor Mark. Governor Mark is not as common now as it was. The materials, and you can just do a Google search for Governor Mark. The materials are a portfolio style, a bit like Investors in People, as I said before. The materials themselves are completely free for any board to use, and I think that would be the best recommendation, is look at those materials. They're very useful in allowing you to see whether, as a board, you are compliant with the expectations of governance. The mark itself involves paying for an external assessor to come and look at your governance in your school for 3 hours, and is supported by the portfolio of evidence that you've collected and submit. And that does come at a cost, but you do end up with a badge and a certificate for 3 years that say you've achieved that mark. As I say, same sort of idea as Investors in People. But the materials are free and they're really useful to use for self-evaluation as a governing board, or just to check practice.